Hello, everybody. It's nice to be in here.
It's publication date, so I'm very excited that everybody's come to share this big day for me out here. So thank you very much.
Yes, a big congratulations to you. I'm very excited to be up here with you.
Thank you, Antonia.
Spending a little bit of time and talking about the book.
Thank you.
All right, so let's get started. I think maybe just start with a little introduction. I mean, obviously we know that you're a food editor, but and you've been reviewing restaurants for the last 15 years.
That's right. I've been a restaurant critic at Los Angeles Magazine for 15 years, and in a way, this book comes out of the process of reviewing restaurants, because about 10 years ago, I just started seeing the word artisanal everywhere, and the words slip into our usage, and food words particularly, like remember fusion and things like that. So I thought maybe artisanal was the new fusion, and it would be sort of left by the wayside. But I kept seeing more and more about artisanal, and the quality was fantastic. I mean, the cultured butter, the fantastic rolls that would come out. So just between butter and rolls, naturally leavened bread, you're saying, wow, this is real quality. So I started becoming curious about the word, and
what was your definition of artisanal?
Well, that's a tricky one. My definition has, I've slowly formulated my definition, because I first had to differentiate between silly artisanal, like artisanal Doritos, and
is that a thing?
Yeah, Doritos came out with an artisanal line, or artisanal bubblegum flavored vodka, and you say, okay, well, this word obviously has become a bit of a buzzword, but it's counterbalanced by incredible quality. So I differentiated between them, and I guess now I would say artisanal is if you're prepared to put the time in that a particular food requires. So for bread, that may be 24 hours. For cheese, that may be 8 months aging. For bourbon, that may be 3 years in a vat. Because if you're not prepared to put the time in, it's very easy a commercial baker can get a loaf of bread from mixing bowl to wrapping in 45 minutes and put artisanal on the label. Right. So for me, the time is very important. Does it go back to a tradition, to a culinary tradition, to a social tradition sometimes, let's say brewing in Wisconsin, or curing hams in Virginia. So for instance, even if that bubblegum artisanal vodka were artisanal, I would have a hard time calling it artisanal, because it doesn't go back to any tradition.
Right.
And thirdly, and this is a kind of curious one, but does it, the intentionality behind it? And it's sort of slightly mystical to talk about the intentionality of a food, but I do think there's an aspect of the work that's going into the making of that food somehow being communicated in that product. And more and more I've come to believe that and think of that as a sign of artisanal food. And lastly, I would say, is the role of the hand still somehow part of it? Because well, you're a chef.
Right.
You can understand something intellectually, and then your hands have to learn how to make it. And when you see a chef work, there's just a naturalness to it. When you see a great baker, all they have to do is put their finger on the dough as it rises. They know exactly where it is.
Yes.
A great cheesemaker, they can look at a huge vat of curd and know exactly when to cut it, when it's going to separate perfectly from the whey. And so there's that, the
intuition.
Intuition, exactly. Even as food has become more and more mechanized, and I don't argue that machines have no role in this. Machines have an important role in this. But but the human hand, the touch, I feel shouldn't be left behind. So I guess those would be, that's a long-winded answer to what do I think is artisanal.
No, I thought that was actually a perfect answer, because the word is used so much, and I think that everyday people are sometimes confused by the definition, and or not understanding the actual correct usage of the word. So I thought that was perfect.
Okay.
And we're going to go back to the technology, because you devote the entire second section to the technology. But let's start with, so the book starts in the 1970s.
Yeah.
Right? Okay, so why are we starting there?
Well, I think by the 1970s, it was pretty clear that big food had triumphed. Whatever traditions were left, and there were plenty of traditions, and it wasn't. We've always been a country that ate well, but the dominant strain of cooking was whatever General Foods was promoting that month, with the big budget, and there are all sorts of reasons why that happened. Some of them were transportation, some of them were refrigeration, but some of them were social and great reasons, like women went back to work and didn't want to be tied to a kitchen their entire lives. So there was a positive aspect of it. Nevertheless, the connections between what we ate and the place it came from, the connections between culinary, culinary heritage had completely been separated from any anchor. And so, there used to be a bumper sticker in the late 60s that said, "Beware of the generals, General Motors, General Electric, and General Foods." So they put it up, that was, so I started in the 70s because it was, as I read, through archives and that, it was the first clear formulation of a rejection of that. There was all sorts of rejections going on, but one of them was the Back to the Land movement that said, we're rejecting a lot of things, and one of them is going to be homogenized food. Now they had to start to learn something to make something better. That's why I started in the 70s.
Fantastic. Okay. So let's say, writing a book is not an easy process by any means. He laughs, and you're thinking about that process deeply now.
Yeah, but this is the pleasurable end of it, yes.
Right, now that it's done and it looks beautiful. Yeah. So looking back at the process, which chapter was the hardest?
Oh, good question. I think the hardest chapter was the chapter on Brooklyn. Because
I love the story, by the way.
Okay.
We met on Saturday and had about a 2-hour discussion, just really, really talking about the book in depth. And I love the story that you tell about Brooklyn because of the thoughts you had about Brooklyn before you got there.
Okay.
So please tell the entire story.
That's a good one. Well, it's just, as a restaurant critic, I've trained myself to go in to a place as a blank slate. Don't have any preconceptions. Don't be reviewing the restaurant you think it should be. Don't be reviewing the restaurant that might have been. Review the restaurant it is, the food you're given, the situation it is, whatever that chef is trying to express.
That goes for all people, not just for restaurant critics.
And that is sort of my cardinal rule in what I do. I'd heard so much about Brooklyn that it weighed on me. It's okay. I know what Brooklyn is. My preconceptions were already well established, and it's really a bad way for a reporter to go anywhere. I went to confirm my opinions, what I thought were my opinions. So, Brooklyn, the over-curated life. Brooklyn that cares about, artisanal ice cubes. The
it's a real thing.
And so off I went in February, I guess, a year ago, with my notebook, ready to write down all these scenes of how crazy the artisanal food world has become. Okay, practically from the first day. The first day I met a guy who barbecues whole briskets outside in Red Hook, Brooklyn, which means, stoking the smokers all night in February in Brooklyn, when I met him, he had so many layers on. His face had so much soot on it. His beard was kind of smoke singed. His hands were, completely covered in soot. When he took off his goggles, it was like a miner who was looking at me. And I said, okay, this is not some dilettante, who's talking about artisanal ice cubes. I mean, this man has just spent the night outdoors in February in Brooklyn to get perfect fall-apart brisket. And sort of from that moment, I just caught myself thinking, okay, you have to drop everything that you thought Brooklyn was and engage with it as a real place. And yes, I did end up, tasting single-source chocolate with heirloom chickens, pecking around me in courtyards. And I did find out what seasonal vermouth is. And I did hear that the water for a distillery had to be shipped from a quarry in upstate New York because it was the only water good enough for that whiskey. And but I also saw, maybe it's because it's right beside Manhattan, because I've seen artisanal wonder in Portland, Oregon, and Portland, Maine, and downtown LA. But I think the juxtaposition of Manhattan just looming over Williamsburg particularly brought it really home to me. These people are driven by excellence.
Yes.
And they have to perform it amid all these kind of jokes about beards and precious lifestyle and everything. And every single one of them was really driven by this idea of excellence. And it made me think, why is this something people laugh at? Is being driven by mediocrity something that you should, celebrate? I mean,
right.
And so it really sort of required me to rethink, adjust, and sort of engage with what was going on. And there were, a lot of the things that go on around artisanal are reflected in Brooklyn. Is when you have too many craft beers in the bodega, is that a sign of gentrification? Is each small craft person that comes up, do they have to define themselves against the person who was there before them? And that really came home to me when I went to Brooklyn Brewery. Garrett, the brewmaster there, sometimes in an interview you have to ask an awkward question, and Brooklyn Brewery now is about 2 or 3 blocks in Williamsburg. It started maybe 20 years ago, I think about 86. So that's more, yeah. And I'd heard these microbrewers in Bushwick and that saying, "Oh, we're not Brooklyn Brewery." And of course, Brooklyn Brewery, Brooklyn has one of the proudest traditions of brewing in the United States until about 1978 when the last brewery closed. So Brooklyn Brewery represented a complete rebirth of brewing in Brooklyn. So at one stage in the interview, I said to Garrett, awkwardly, how do you feel about these small brewers defining themselves against you?
Right.
And he gave me an answer that always has remained with me. He said, it bugs the hell out of me because it's like telling a kid you can only love them when they're 5 and they're cute.
Right.
So that is, it was sort of a heartfelt thing to say because so much of artisanal has come to be the argument of we're small, we're tiny, we're micro, macro, nano, we do one of it, therefore we're artisans. And the big question looming over the artisanal movement is, how can we grow? This has caught on. Why are we pretending it hasn't caught on? How do we grow with integrity? How do we maintain our values? How do we maintain our quality? So to hear him say, that, it's obviously very much on his mind.
Well, I think Brooklyn, when you and I spoke, it's such, it's where the technology meets the small, still shop. We were talking about, the guys who still make pickles in barrels. And, they've been doing it for 100 years, and an artistry that was kind of passed down from generation to generation, right? And it's still this small shop.
Right.
So and then we move into the idea of growth in this business.
Yeah.
And then you have all the smaller venues saying, well, Brooklyn Brewery, we can now get Brooklyn Brewery in Whole Foods. So therefore it's no longer artisanal, right? Because it's not small, because it's not. So it's a great segue to my next question, which is, so obviously you write quite a bit about technology.
Yes.
Okay. In fact, the entire second section is just about that.
Right. Yeah. It is.
No, but I think it's such a important part because I mean, if you're just making one log of cheese every week because that's all you can do, how can you grow? How many people can actually see this, right?
Right.
So whether it's bread, distilling, like you just talked about, brewing, baking, why did you feel like you had to devote such a large space to the subject?
Well, I felt technology was sort of the elephant in the room of this whole artisanal thing, because technology now is perceived almost as a negative. Chefs will allow that they have a sous vide machine, but they really want to be known as craftspeople. So I had to go back and figure out, how did technology become a negative? I mean, technology is at the basis of so many foods. If we just keep the argument to the United States, you know, the grist mill in Kentucky that ground the corn that would then be put into a still for distilling. The cider press in colonial America that the cider was made in, that could then be turned into vinegar. You know, those are just two basic technologies. One is the technology of the water wheel creating power, and the other is, you know, the screw press creating power.
Right. So we no longer use donkeys to
right.
try.
Yes. I mean, these liberated animals and humans. You know. So it's technology, and how did technology suddenly, with artisans, become something that we completely reject? So I tried to tell the story through three ingredients, and since I couldn't have characters, I had ingredients. The first ingredient was bourbon, and I went to Maker's Mark, and I had fantastic tours of distilleries in Kentucky, and see that all these distilleries are still at grist mills. They don't use the grist mill anymore, but you see the history right there in front of you. Maker's Mark, there's still a wheel turning water. The second ingredient was baking soda.
It's my favorite part.
Okay,
the best
so
one.
you know, we take baking soda for granted, and what could be more American than biscuits? And but when baking soda first became popular in about 1820s, it was it required a total mind shift. I mean, here was this white powder that if you put it in with flour and some form of acid, would make your dough rise. And you know, before this, women, this doesn't say people, women had to maintain these yeast cultures, which were incredibly laborious and they all idiosyncratic, and if it got too cold, it wouldn't work, and if it got too hot, it overworked. And so, you know, we take it for granted. Oh, you just snip open the Fleischmann's yeast, and that's yeast. Well, yeast had to be kept alive, and it took an awful lot of work. So the idea that here was this powder that you put into your mixing bowl and it would make something rise was radical. And people had to get used to the idea. And all sorts of arguments and narratives grew around it. The idea of purity. Pretty soon, people were saying, oh, don't use their baking powder because it's not pure. Ours is pure. Then another narrative is brand loyalty. People said, oh, well, use, you know, Arm & Hammer, King's, all sorts of brands at brand loyalty. And finally, buy our product in our sealed box. So the idea of food coming in, the purity coming in sealed box. So that was pretty radical, because prior to that, everything was sold in big barrels at the grocery store that stood on the grocery store floor. So it was I try to weave in different narratives. And then the final ingredient in technology is brewing, beer. And here was this, anybody who's been to a brew club meeting knows that they're rowdy affairs and quirky and, but here was a group of people who said, we can make better beer. Why has beer suddenly become mediocre? American beer is something that should be fantastic. And in the 60s and 70s, it required sort of a lot of trickery. They had to isolate yeast strains from beers that they liked. Buying malt was not that easy. But there was this idea of, why can't I make it? And that's the artisanal kind of the start to it. After that, it gets into why can't I make it better? The idea of excellence. But the first one is, why can't I make it? Is beer that hard to make? People have been making it for thousands of years. I can reject beer without flavor and try and make my own. And so it sort of dovetails back as the final section of the final chapter of the second section into, yes, and here we are now living in the world of people who said, I can make it and I can make it better. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think the distaste for technology, and specifically taking the idea of baking powder, baking soda.
Yeah.
You brought up obviously this brand loyalty, these large brands saying, buy this brand.
Right.
I thought you brought up a great point when we were talking, which was these cheesy little markers, for lack of a better word, where, if you bought this brand, you were loyal to this brand, you got a set of knives.
Right.
So I feel like that's where probably a lot of the distaste for, it just being so generic.
Right.
How do we bring it back to doing these things on our own again? And obviously we're talking about the second section of the book, the technology, but that leads me into, going back to the first part, which would be the conversations that you had with Nancy Silverton.
Well,
because
yeah.
Talking about baking and
yeah.
and how she started and her thoughts behind it. I know you mentioned she's like, I'm just a young girl from Encino who wanted to make better bread.
Well,
here's my Hobart.
Right. I was very taken with Nancy's story because it represented for me a real trajectory that united lots of these stories. And that was the difference between the United States artisan and a European artisan. And the European artisan has tradition to draw on, master craftspeople to teach them, still guilds, a whole heritage of learning. The American artisan starts with nothing. They might have, the whole Earth catalog and dreams. So it's a compelling narrative that without any form of formal education, a person decides not just to learn a craft, baking, brewing, making bitters, whichever one of these many artisanal foods there are, but become excellent at it and become the best that they can at it. And so Nancy's story was, first of all, a very LA story, so I really felt drawn to that. And secondly, it completely represented that narrative of, I'm going to become a craftsperson, I'm going to become excellent at it. And so there were great scenes, like, she and Mark Peel were about to open Campanile and La Brea Bakery simultaneously in 1988 on La Brea, and there was so much scaffolding up, and she just said, I've got to get away from here. And she put the slurry, the natural leavening that she'd made in buckets, put them in her car, got her flour, drove down to a warehouse sort of near Venice Boulevard, where the 10 freeway crosses Venice Boulevard. As a writer, you're looking for scenes. I mean, that's sort of the selfish, give me a scene. So, okay, as she was telling me, and I was in this warehouse south of the 10 freeway on Venice, And it was just me, the slurry, the flour, a deck oven, and a Hobart mixer, and I had to become an artisan. And so I'm writing as fast, writing as fast as I can. But it's a fantastic. It was, each artisan has their own crucible where they become one or they don't. This was her crucible. She was either going to come out of this room with 5 types of bread that she could make commercially, or pretty much the dream was over. And she came out with 5 workable recipes of naturally leavened bread. This quirky baby that if you feed it too much flour, it won't do anything. And and the temperature, the humidity, all these things that yeast simplifies. And yes, she went back to La Brea Avenue, started the bakery. They sold their first loaf to City Cafe, just up the street on the last day of 1988. Somebody walked it up the street. So it's almost touching because the artisanal food world has become so big and so marketed. And you say, wow, La Brea Bakery started with somebody walking a couple of loaves up the street to City Cafe to make the first delivery. And it was really person to person.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And we all know how that story ended.
Yeah.
She's doing very well.
Yeah.
I remember La Brea Bakery. I'm from New York, so getting good bread in Los Angeles, and I love that that's part of her story, that she just felt like San Francisco had amazing bread.
Yeah.
They had that
Pioneer,
pioneer
right.
sourdough,
Yeah.
crispy, textured outside, and why didn't Los Angeles have it?
Yeah.
And she just kind of set on her way to
Right.
say,
She's going to make it better. Right?
how am I going to make it better?
Yeah.
Exactly. Okay, so you start part 3 with a particular story about Wisconsin cheese. Right? Upland Reserve.
Yeah.
It's a great story, obviously slightly obsessive,
Yeah.
about searching for quality. And when
Yeah.
I wrote quality, like capital QU, because I feel like that is what really speaks to this part. The milk comes from cows that hasn't been out for more than 12 hours.
Right.
Does that cheese represent the modern quality-driven food artisan?
I think I was very taken by obsessive quality.
Right.
Because it's great to meet somebody who is driven by that. And this farm in Wisconsin, Upland's Cheese, they are very much driven by quality obsessively, in a fantastic way. I mean, they only make cheese from the milk of their own cows. The milk is never more than 12 hours old. It's not a mix of milk. It's obviously not pasteurized, which is sort of a word that means all sorts of things to all sorts of people. But
right.
they would never pasteurize the milk because it would take away all the nuances. So I make a little argument for pasteurization in the book, but theirs is not pasteurized, and they age it. Talk about time. They age it for whatever amounts of months, in fact, sometimes years, they feel the cheese requires to become as perfect as it will. And so I went there and I just tried to understand, okay, cheese is pretty basic. And Andy Hatch, the cheesemaker there, will say, you culture the milk, that acidifies it, that drops the pH, that means pathogens keep away. Then you add rennet, and that means you'll have curds and whey, and you separate that. And in his own words, and this is a master cheesemaker, and then you're left with a big blob of fat and protein, And so
Delicious.
it's got a long way before it becomes that delicious slice of cheese.
Right.
So, but at each thing with Andy's cheesemaking is, it's allowing whatever nuance is latent, first of all, in the milk, to make itself, to project itself. The aging allows more nuances because they wash it with a salt brine every day, which brings out a microflora on the rind. Everything is about nuance. How do you build in nuance into this cheese? And finally, the great aspect of nuances is the time. That's what's going to bring it all together. So, yes, making cheese making that blob is not that hard, but at each stage you're taking like for instance, he doesn't culture it immediately, which means he doesn't. I don't want to geek out on this, but he doesn't acidify it immediately, which means he allows whatever lacto fermentation that's going to occur already from the milk to occur by itself. So he's not telling the milk, you have to do this. He's saying, what do you have? Tell me what you have to say. So these are all tiny little...
He's talking to the milk, basically. That's what we're talking about, obsessive quality.
I've met people in Vermont playing NPR to the cows. I mean, believe me.
Fantastic.
Yeah, talk about taking it,
It's one step further.
Yeah,
I want to know what my chickens' names are and all of that kind of stuff as well. So
well,
I believe in that.
Talk radio would make the milk go off in a completely wrong direction. It has to be nice NPR that makes the cows do perfect milk. Yeah.
But with that kind of obsessive...
It's hot on these slides.
Yeah.
Excuse me for a second.
No,
yeah, go ahead.
So, just kind of talking about obsessive quality.
Right.
And then bringing that into one of the parts of part 3, which would be scaling.
Yeah.
So how does that relate? So you have someone who won't use milk, if it's older than 12 hours. How does that work from when you want your business to grow, when you want it to scale, like how do those two entities then sort of collide?
Yeah. Well, I think scale is the big argument here in artisanal food because, yes, it did start small. It started small because people couldn't make big. It's like Alice Waters with a single menu. She says, I didn't know how to do a la carte. Of course, Japanese had to be single menu because I couldn't cook 2 things at once. I didn't know how to do it. They had to start small because they were trying to figure out, well, how do you make a loaf of bread? But, I mean, we live in a country where you can get a pretty good domestic saison beer and ash-covered chèvre in a better food court. We can't pretend that it's a bunch of back-to-the-landers who got lucky and it's because in a way it's kind of false. And false is what we accuse General Foods of being.
Exactly.
Part of an artisan is like owning whatever the reality is. And the reality is artisanal food has grown. And artisanal food is creating opportunities, jobs, career paths to many people, many young people in the economy that's changing dramatically. Where it's a fantastic career option. So I make a strong argument in the book that it's time to celebrate that and it's time to own it. And if we take the word artisanal, an artisan, it has always meant independence. And when you think of the coppersmith in Philadelphia in 1770, the farmstead housewife on the prairie who was churning a bit of extra butter so she could sell it at the market, it was about independence. There's an element of independence in the artisanal narrative. And so long before it came to mean it's about small, it was about being independent. And these businesses are creating independence. So I make a strong argument, and perhaps not a popular one, because it's easier in a way to say, oh, only small is artisan, because that completely differentiates you from big. And of course, you have to be wary because there's lots of big breweries that have, for example, who've discovered, oh, let's pretend we're small. We'll have a little side brewery. There'll be so we can't become naive about it. But that said, owning the scale that you're operating on is something to celebrate. Yeah.
Absolutely. It's almost a little unfair to only call the small.
Yeah,
I would argue.
I think so too. Yeah.
So artisan foods tend to cost more.
Yeah.
So there's no secrets there. Is there a danger then of them seeming elitist?
There's a danger of it, sure. But I can think of all the benefits that artisan food sort of represents. That piece of cheese that arrives on a cheese plate. It's creating real jobs in an agricultural setting. It's allowing, I mean, one of the most touching stories that I came across is these two women partners in Vermont who were total back-to-the-landers in the 70s, taught themselves how to make a cheese, have lived on this farm for, well, 40 years now, and recently they donated their land to the Vermont Land Trust so that their land will always be agricultural. It will never have a housing subdivision on it. So, incredibly generous, and then you say, okay, these are benefits that people are not even aware of. When we go for a drive and we see green fields and the American landscape as beautiful and vital as it can be, a lot of it is because artisans are making that land profitable enough that it can remain agricultural land. So is there a danger of it seeming elitist? Yeah, I mean, you can look at things with whatever kind of lens you want to look at things. There's always going to be cheaper. There's always going to be blander. I think it's important to champion some of these hidden aspects of artisanal food.
As much as we can.
Oh, another, if I may, on a sort of urban aspect of it, I was really struck by this in Milwaukee. There's parts of Milwaukee near the river that were sort of abandoned warehouses, kind of the shells of an industry that no longer exists. Now, if you go to these parts of Milwaukee today, and Milwaukee's not some glamorous town, it's a good Midwestern working class town, these former warehouses are now distilleries, breweries, there's even a working creamery, bakeries, coffee roasters, and all very close together. And so the artisanal movement has reinvigorated American cities in a fantastic way.
Absolutely.
So if that cup of coffee costs a little more, or that absinthe that you taste at the distillery is a bit more expensive than Smirnoff vodka at the liquor store, there are many benefits like that.
Absolutely. Yeah. So that's basically part 3.
That's part 3.
That's where we were discussing.
Yeah.
But I'd like to go back to part 1. I know we're jumping around a little bit, and I know that you check in with everyone in part 3 as kind of the big ending.
Yeah.
But let's go. We talked about Nancy briefly,
Yeah.
but I loved all the other. And the best part, when you read part 1, there's these amazing stories, and it's broken up into individuals, across the United States, who basically you're telling their story.
Yeah.
And I thought that was just such a great way to tell the story. So it wasn't so much about information, but it's information told through these specific stories.
Yeah.
Mine is the deli in Ann Arbor. That's one of my favorites. So if you could give us a little background on that.
Okay. Well, this is the chapter. I called each chapter To Something, because I wanted to tell the book through the eyes of the people who experienced it. I didn't want it to be sort of a distant narrator sort of opining. I wanted to try and tell it through the eyes of the people who experienced it. And so this chapter is To Market,
right.
And it concentrates on Zingerman's Deli in Ann Arbor, which is a famous, I hear sounds of recognition. Zingerman's is a fantastic deli in a college town, Ann Arbor. And again, it was this trajectory of people starting with no background in what they had chosen to do. Mm-hmm. And so this was a bunch of people who had graduated from University of Michigan, had found jobs in those years where you've graduated but you're not quite ready for reality, and so they got jobs in restaurants, and they were working in restaurants, and it was perfectly happy, perfectly good. But
that's what people do when they don't know what they're doing.
You probably
they just go work in a restaurant.
You probably have experience with it.
That's how I've got into my.
No, there were servers and whatnot, and then they started to think, well, why don't we open a little deli? And a place came up, a little red brick building. Anybody who's been to Zingerman's knows it. And they modeled it on sort of the Jewish neighborhood deli, but not too defined. They had plenty of Newski's bacon and everything. It was a hangout place. But what the fellow who started it, Ari Weinzweig, it was so interesting because here was a guy in a T-shirt in a college town, and he'd call up the cheese sort of wholesalers and say, "Could you send me some Comté?" And they'd say, "Where are you?" And he'd say, "Ann Arbor." And they'd say, "Well, how much do you want?" And they'd say, "Oh, I don't know, a quarter of a wheel." And I'd say, "Oh,
Click.
Click. I have no interest in selling to you. It's not worth the time to send a truck to Ann Arbor." And so this rejection, rejection can be very good. It forced him to say, "Okay, I want good American cheeses. These guys won't deliver it. I'm not even sure that they would deliver good cheese because they're massive wholesalers." And he started to contact farmstead cheesemakers. And the other aspect of Zingerman's, which is really interesting, is they started offering samples. And we take it for granted that you walk into a store and you'll be offered a sample. But in the mid to late 70s, it was for the owner of the business considered it stealing if their employees offered samples.
Right.
And then they also changed, this is something I'm interested in because I write, but they also changed the vocabulary of food description. And they sort of rejected this whole idea of it had to be imported to be good.
Right.
Because imported was what artisanal is today, it means everything. Imported was in 1975. Right. Oh, it's imported. It's good. So they sort of rejected this whole idea and said, okay, well, there has to be American quality. There's perfectly good cheese here. There's perfectly good bacon. My goodness, Newski's is in Wisconsin, next door. Let's draw on what we have here. And it wasn't fancy schmancy. They would get their olive oil, for instance, from the old Italian grocery stores in Detroit, and they would drive it, over. They would drive to Newski's and get the bacon. They would get, each little thing they found it, and slowly but surely, a new language of food description came about. They wrote little handwritten signs saying, "This is why you want this," because they're very honest. They said, from the start, we knew we had to give people a reason to buy this.
Right.
We have to, and that's maybe where the story, which is so important today,
yes.
The story, people are so taken with, it can be taken too far. What's the name of the cow? But even within that, it's a way of connecting ourselves with a food, with what makes this special. So there's a sort of narrative aspect to. So I felt Zingerman's was sort of groundbreaking in many of these ways. Now Zingerman's, it's considered the symbol of what modern artisanal food retailing is. And when Ari Weinzweig goes to the fancy food shows, the crowds part before him. So
he couldn't get any Comté, and now all of a sudden
he still wears his T-shirt and Doc Martens, but it's really completely been transformed.
So just one more question, and then we're going to take questions from the audience. What would your advice to someone who wants to become an artisan?
Whew.
I know it's a loaded question.
Yeah. There has to be an element of don't take yourself too seriously in it, because there's going to be a lot of the learning to become a craftsperson. You're going to make a lot of, in chicken and cheesemaker terms, what they call chicken cheese. What you serve what you toss to the chickens. You have to be prepared for that, the actual hardship, the internal journey of, my God, that batch didn't come out well. I spent so long. I thought I'd figured it out, and it came out lousy. In all of these artisans that I covered, they've all gone through that.
Failure.
Yeah. For Nancy, it's heartbreaking. She would say, the dough looked so beautiful when it was going in the oven, and I'd slashed it perfectly. For a baker, the slash is so key because that's sort of how it's going to swell in the oven. I'd slashed it perfectly. It came out lousy. There's an awful lot of that. I think choosing the thing you're going to make, I don't know if that's. I'm thinking of the people who originally started Upland's Cheese, Mike Gingrich. He said, well, I bought Steve Jenkins' book on cheese, and I got some samples of cheeses from Murray's, and we tasted them with a little Chardonnay, and I decided what cheese I wanted to devote my life to based on that. So you're saying
you were expecting more.
Yeah. Oh, I traveled to Switzerland. I read every book I could find.
Right.
It was no, but I like this sample from Murray's, so I decided to base my life on it. So there's that. I think importantly is think of yourself as being part of, it's maybe not the right word, but a movement, because there is competition, but if there's backbiting and, oh, that person is making too much, they can't be an artisan, or there's healthy competitiveness and there's unhealthy competitiveness. And I think that in everything, the culinary arts are an example of generosity and support, but it can also take a turn, and there can be some criticism in
Really?
Really? Yes, I'm completely opening your eyes to this world. But in artisans, I think of yourself as part of a bigger movement, and as an old cheesemaker said, take notes and don't be afraid to ask for help. And I think that goes for all the artisans. Yeah.
That's fantastic. Well, thank you so much.
Oh, my pleasure.
I'd love to.
So we have time for some questions. Just a quick reminder, questions at Live Talks LA generally start with a W or an H, sometimes a D. We do not believe in two-part questions, and only Antonia gets to ask follow-up questions. Do I have a question?
Hi, Patrick.
Hi, Allison.
So, if you were to become an artisan, what would you choose to make and why?
Oh, a question I haven't been asked. Okay, I'll say a distiller, and I would make some form of strong alcohol, and don't take that as a reflection on me, but. I did become sort of fascinated by the idea of distilling, because when we were in Kentucky visiting, they let you right into where they make it, and there's these big mash tubs where the cornmeal is fermenting into essentially a light beer that will then be put in the still, and they say, "Oh, go ahead, put your finger in it." And anybody who's taken a food tour, the one thing you never hear is "go ahead, put your finger in it." A baker might allow you to touch the dough. A cheesemaker would rather see you in a hazmat suit than actually sticking your finger in anything near what they're making. But in distilling, it's going to go through this still, and it's going to be purified to such a degree that whatever microbes you're introducing are not going to make any difference.
It might actually make it better.
Yeah, probably. and then there's this sort of magical aspect of the alcohol, because alcohol and water boil at different temperatures. The alcohol is drawn off by boiling, so it condenses, and it goes in the still through the condensing wire. It's condensed into something very pure. So it goes from liquid to steam to something incredibly pure. And then, of course, you've got really strong, what they call in Kentucky white dog, which is a very strong, pure alcohol. And then that's why it has to age. So it ages in this charred white oak casks. And to go into the rick houses in Kentucky, they're all stacked. And it's magical. The only thing that's going to improve it now is time. In summer, the temperature will open up the staves. It's going to release, condense. In winter, it's going to contract. For several years, this is going to occur. And so I'd never really looked at a glass of bourbon in the same way. And a real glass, a glass of great bourbon is a whole journey. So if I could apply myself to one, and I'm not sure that I have the discipline required to be a real food artisan, but I think distilling. Yeah.
Hi, Patrick.
Oh, hi, Sarah.
Do you think that we're ever going to be in danger of achieving or reaching a peak food culture? I'm thinking smorgasbord. I'm thinking the gentrification of Grand Central Market and Pine Street in Portland. It seems that these new food courts are like the thing, but I just wonder, is there going to be a point where something else is going to take the place of food in a certain way?
Well, it's a tricky question. I haven't been to Smorgasburg. I hear it's great. I have been to Grand Central Market. There's a lot of, good purveyors there. I think if food manages to maintain its integrity and make clear that there's a kind of narrow scope good and a greater good to what it's doing. The narrow scope good is, this is good, this is excellent, this is fantastic, that's a moment of pleasure. There's enough mediocrity, there's enough lack of pleasure in life, there's enough pain. Let's celebrate something that, even if it's freshly churned ice cream, let's celebrate it. The greater good is, it's creating jobs, it's keeping places viable, neighborhoods viable, cities viable. It's maintaining traditions, it's keeping us linked to a heritage. And sometimes it can seem like, oh my goodness, I can't bear to hear about another, bean to bar, 79% cocoa, whatever. But on the other hand, that chocolate bar is maintaining a farm somewhere, in Central America as a viable concern too. So we can hear too much about it. And, maybe my book is hearing too much about it too. But there is a greater good to all this. I think you just have to find which aspect of it speaks to you. It is a bit like music, theater, literature. Some parts of it are not going to resonate with you. But if you find the aspect, I know that you're very involved in Food Forward, for example, and here's an incredible organization that's, among its many aspects, attributes, minimizing food waste, teaching people who want to learn how to make jams and preserves, like in schools that are growing a lot of vegetables, how to preserve that. People who want to go into small cottage businesses out of their own kitchens, like making jams. Food Forward is such a fantastic organization. So find the aspect of the artisanal movement that speaks to you and sort of engage with that.
Hi.
Hi.
Do you think there are any local food artisans that are going to have a long-term impact?
That's a great question.
I mean, there are a lot. If I think, let's say, of a jam maker, there's a fantastic jam maker called M. Greenwood Jams, Margaret Greenwood, and she's making jams, small batch, in downtown LA. She was one of these artisans who she was always writing her labels by hand, and it was one of those moments in an artisan's sort of existence. She'd grown to the stage where she wasn't sure she could write her own labels by hand, and it's touching that you say, this is so heartfelt. Somebody is putting everything they have into this. The hours she's not making the jams, of course, only local produce. She's up half the night writing the labels by hand. So that would be my example of a local artisan. We all go to the farmer's market and we see somebody with their table there, and so often we walk by. But I'd sort of invite us all to just pause that second and say, think of it as, oh my goodness, this person, maybe was up half the night writing labels. This person was loading their, Subaru hatchback with these crates at 4 or 5 in the morning to get here.
It's their day.
it's their
Sunday
day,
is their day.
and to go back home with the same amount of goods that you set out in the morning, that's pretty crushing. So that does not quite answer your question because there's so many artisans, but each one represents a real story. Do you have any that you would say are making a lasting impact? Okay. Oh, yes, yes. Very much so. That's a good example.
A quick question as I work my way to one over here. Hummus, almond flavored, pistachio flavored, artichoke flavored. Are we getting carried away?
I'm a traditionalist, chickpea.
Hi, Patrick.
Hi, how are you?
I have a question for you. And so, how does a chef with artisanal aspirations really shine at a so-called general restaurant? For example, I think of all the restaurants in LA that get written about and it becomes so trendy and buzzy, and whether it's a restaurant in San Gabriel Valley or someone with a celebrated chef, but what about those chefs or whatnot at, say, a large-scale resort or hotel who are doing really sincere, wonderful things, but for someone like you as a restaurant critic, what catches your attention, or what would they need to do to kind of help their story be told?
Okay, well, I'm going to let, I'll say a few things, but Antonia should really be the person to answer this question. I think if you're starting out, I was a line cook. I never went above line cook. But the magic word for line cook, I don't know in English, in French, it's oui chef. Yes, chef. Whatever they say to do, you do it. You do it as well as possible. Nobody's going to ask your opinion. Nobody's going to ask unless the chef asks you, don't expect to give it. I think for a young cook, it's really apply yourself, apply yourself, apply yourself. Your moment will come. Resorts, Gavin Kaysen, who's now a important chef in Minneapolis, started out in a resort. I don't think you have to look at the place you're working in. Some resorts have incredible food, but if you're learning, there is an aspect of the artisan in this. Apply yourself to become as excellent as possible, which means work as fast as you can, as excellently as you can. And Antonia is obviously knows a lot more about this than I do.
Well, I think your question is, how can an artisan really shine in that kind of a setting? So something that's a little bit more structured to general clientele. Maybe in resorts, people tend to be there more for vacation or business, and they just want their eggs Benedict in the morning and not really care about the whole dining experience. Is that what you're asking? What comes to mind if I was in that scenario, I think an artisan would be able to shine in that kind of scenario. So I gave the example of eggs Benedict, right? So I was just in Puerto Vallarta, right? And you're expecting amazing traditional Mexican food, but you won't get that in the resort. You really need to venture outside in order to really get that. That being said, there's a way to kind of make it your own. So, being able to make your own English muffin, really kind of highlight that on the menu, saying that there are certain elements to these very traditional dishes that we love on a resort menu. I don't think anyone should ever turn their nose up at people who work in hotels or restaurants, I think, or hotel restaurants or resorts. I think, sometimes restaurant chefs look at that, it's like, that's not, there's nothing creative about that. You're just cooking for the masses, even if it's the Four Seasons or the Peninsula. Because there's those small nuances of quality, and that you can take the very traditional, like I'm saying, in a great eggs Benedict, and turning that into creating your own English muffin, or that's just the example that I would give. But you can really find those examples in any traditional kind of food.
Right. You can make a great club sandwich or a lousy club sandwich.
Absolutely.
Your hollandaise can be perfect and light, or your hollandaise can be half curdled. So if you take the idea of excellence as the idea behind artisans, make that menu as excellent as it can be.
Yeah, club sandwich. People are curing their own bacon. They're making their own Pullman loaf. You know, I mean, I wouldn't go as far as, you know, growing my lettuce in the backyard. You probably don't have enough room.
Just tell the customers that you've grown it. And
Right, and then you'll be fine. But it is about choosing those perfect ingredients. But you could go as far as curing your own bacon, making your own bread for a club sandwich that we all have eaten 100 times over.
And our final question for the evening.
Hey, Patrick. So you talked a lot about size and how there's this misconception that you have to be small in order to be artisan. Yeah. What are some of the ways that you saw sort of the integrity maintained in larger artisan format, I guess? Or as Mark, you mentioned, how do they maintain the integrity and the tradition at that scale?
Well, Maker's Mark. Of course, bourbon is defined by there's legal definitions to bourbon. You know, how much corn is in the mash. The oak barrels have to be new oak, charred new oak. So they're legally, those would be set examples of quality, but they're legally defined. Market, there's an interesting argument about proof. A few years ago, they tried to drop their proof, their alcohol content, and I guess they did it for many reasons, but the backlash from Maker's Mark's lovers was so huge that they felt that it was adulterating, really, this product that they'd come to love. So a lot of the quality sort of argument comes from the clientele. To grow with integrity, it's really the key question to this. So if I think of Upland's cheese, okay, they've got a herd of 300 cows, and their main cheese, Upland's Reserve, they only make it in summer months because it's pasture milk. It's only when the cows are eating fresh pasture out in the fields. It's rotational grazing, of course, so the cows are eating different milk all the time. How did they increase their productivity? They didn't buy 300 more cows. They started a second line of a different cheese that they make with winter milk. So these cows are not eating fresh pasture. But it's a different approach to cheese making. It's a runny cheese. It doesn't require the aging. And so the nuances of the milk, of the pasture, don't have to sort of come out in such a defined way in this other winter cheese. So just by doing that, they've doubled their productivity, but they're still working with the same amount of cows. They're still working with the same volume of milk. So that's another example. I think the ultimate way of growing this is why being obsessive is important. You know, I can't think of a single person, brewer, baker, distiller, ham curer, chocolate maker, coffee roaster, bitters maker, who wasn't completely devoted to the idea of quality. And these are not people who will make a concession. If they would much rather do less and keep going at the quality that they have been going. So when you've got that, when you're driven by that idea, I sort of feel I'm in safe hands with people who want to grow with that level of drive. I think the tricky part is, and I'm thinking of brewing here, when, you know, craft brewing is very popular and very big breweries are buying very small craft breweries now. And so here's the question. If Anheuser-Busch has bought you, are they going to start penciling out ingredients? Because how did this all start? By big industry penciling out ingredients, nuances, flavors. It was all about industrial efficiency. And yes, I really think we have to be open-eyed about this. There is a danger. I think a true artisan is so driven by the idea of excellence that they will just refuse to go down that path. Maybe it's slightly naive of me, but you know, I've been very inspired by the people I've met on this journey.
Thank you very much, Patrick. Thank you,
Thank you.
Antonia.
Thank you very much.